If you would head to your seats, we'll get Drew up here. And we are utilizing Charles and David this afternoon to try to generate some interest in Clarendon County in the 250th, in the Battleground Trust, and then Liberty Trail. And if you've noticed from the slide show that we had on earlier about our sponsors, there's a slide that shows a picture of the Liberty Trail and all the sites. And Carol and I are overjoyed that the folks building the Liberty Trail have already picked 6 sites in Clarendon County. So at 4 o'clock, we're hoping to have 2 or 3 mayors, the the chairman of the county council, and their horse holders here, so that Charles and David can do a little pep talk on them for us. So, if you need to sign in to the...
if you want to use the Wi-Fi, come by. If you want to use the Wi-Fi, come by and get the sign-in email and the password, and you can sign into the school Wi-Fi.
Okay, Drew's on.
I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened in the Low Country in July of 1781. And as we get started, I'm going to do a really quick review to give you to set the stage of what was happening with General Greene leading up to July. I'm going to start with Guilford Courthouse. Everybody's familiar with the battle in March. When Cornwallis started to go to Wilmington, Greene comes back to South Carolina. And in April 25th, we have the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill. Marion and Lee are over at Fort Watson in April, and then they go to Fort Knox. We have some other things happening here. Rawdon is going to abandon Camden in May, about the same time. Orangeburg Falls, Fort Granby Falls, Fort Dauphin Falls, and then we have Greene going over to 96. We have the siege with the assault in June, the decision to abandon 96 by Greene in June 19th, and then early July, Kruger is going to go, by this time Rawdon is already in Orangeburg, and we come to July 12th of 1781. General Greene is now joined on the 12th by Thomas Sumter and Francis Marion. They're just outside of Orangeburg. Of course, Rawdon has a lot of Greene troops. There's a lot of sickness. You can tell that Greene's army has probably been through hell and back by this time. And when overtures are suggested for the British to come out and meet the Americans, the British stand down, and so basically Greene withdraws to the high hills of Santee. This area, from what I understand, is about 200 feet above sea level. They can catch summer breezes and weather these hot months and take a break. Of course, the British are doing the same thing in Orangeburg. And we come to what I'm going to call, and many people call, the Dog Day Foray. The Dog Day Foray was not a term that was used during the Revolutionary War, but author William Gilmore Simms in the 19th century wrote a novel based on the Forayers, and so many of us use that term today. And that's generally the months of July and August in summertime. What is this foray about? Well, while the main Continentals are standing down for a break, we've got the partisans going to work. Thomas Sumter in command, Francis Marion, Light Horse Harry Lee, who is a Continental, is along for the trip. Wade Hampton, Henry Hampton are all dispersed in various directions down to Dorchester and Berkeley counties. Light Horse Harry is sent to Dorchester, who JD just talked about. When they get to that fort, and I might add, Dorchester and Monk's Corner were basically kind of pivotal logistics points because Dorchester is at the head of the Ashley River, Monk's Corner is the head of the Cooper River, and I'd like to focus on these vessels and the river transportation somewhat in this talk. But Light Horse Harry gets to Dorchester only to find that the British have virtually abandoned it. A neighboring plantation, they find 4 supply wagons, 1 loaded with ammunition and horses. He captures them and starts them en route to Green up at the high hills. Wade Hampton, Henry Hampton goes to Four Hole Bridge, which is between Orangeburg and Dorchester. Wade Hampton is sent to Goose Creek. Now the mission is to basically try to cut off reinforcements and or supplies or withdrawal or whatnot between Orangeburg and Charleston, but they're finding that the British are nowhere to be seen in these areas. Wade Hampton on Sunday morning goes to Goose Creek, surrounds the church, there's service going on. He captures and paroles some of the folks, takes their horses. Then a group goes down to the quarterhouse down towards Charleston. They have a skirmish there. And then he comes back up to Goose Creek. Now, this is kind of where my talk begins. Taking a look at what happens as he's going to head back towards Monk's Corner. Keep in mind that Thomas Sumter and Marion are coming from the Utah Springs direction and coming down across what's now Lake Moultrie, much of the distance. Wade Hampton goes to Goose Creek, Light Horse Harry to Dorchester, and they're all supposed to meet over in Monk's Corner and harass and confront the British in Monk's Corner. The 19th Regiment, fairly newly arrived in June from Ireland, is there under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Coates. They know the Americans are coming, so they basically withdraw from their camps in Fort Fairlawn area in Monk's Corner and go over to Biggin's Church, and they're standing by. Monday morning, Wade Hampton is traveling from Goose Creek to towards Monk's Corner. Now, there is a statement here, July 22nd, from Sumter to Greene, and he says, Wade Hampton burns 2 schooners at Strawberry. Now, I guess it depends on how you read this, but it sounds to me and to some folks like he's talking about Strawberry Ferry on the Cooper River. If you were to come from Goose Creek to go to Strawberry Crossing, and I'm not sure if this even logically made sense that he would go there for any reason on this foray, but you'd go about 7 or 8 miles, and then you'd have to detour about 4 miles to get to the Strawberry Crossing. Interestingly enough, though, at Strawberry Ferry on the west side of the river, there is a shipwreck. Okay, it's about a 50-foot, probably a double-ender vessel that could fit the bill. I tried to find out who originally found this wreck and what was on it and whatnot, and I found that Kevin Rooney, a friend and diver, in 1974, along with Val Bruno, first discovered this wreck. There were no artifacts to speak of on board, except for in a concretion there was a Confederate artillery butt, nothing relating to the Revolutionary War. But in the 1990s, the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology with South Carolina established an underwater heritage trail that buoyed various vessels and landing sites along the river there so divers could go and have a tourist dive. In their literature, they refer to this wreck as possibly a Revolutionary War wreck sunk by Wade Hampton. Was it sunk by Wade Hampton? Well, in my conversation with Charles Baxley a few years ago, we discussed that the wreck had been clad, and it was covered with brass cladding tax, but almost no cladding left. Got permission from Jim Spiro, state underwater archaeologist, to remove a small section of cladding and some tax. Through the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, we connected with the Huntley Lab, the Warren Lash Conservation Center. Through this slide and to show you kind of where the wreck is, when I say Strawberry Vessel, and where you see the landing is where the crossing would have been. The lab used X-ray fluorescence and energy dispersive X-ray spectrometry. I can't even hardly say it, let alone tell you what it is, but they came to find that the results were consistent with a zinc alloy. Results indicate the attacks of brass or copper alloy, and that the Strawberry Vessel was constructed no earlier than 1810 and no later than 1870. So that's totally ruled out. Wade Hampton did not sink that ship. Now, if he continues on up to Monk's Corner, he's going to go by the entrances to various plantations, Mulberry, one being Lewisfield. Get a little bit further up and you have Fairlawn Plantation. On the other side of the river, you have Biggins Church and Wadbu Creek. So I'm going to jump the river for just a minute and go over to Wadbu Creek, and I'll come back to the river in a minute. Here's kind of a little look at a little closer there where Wadbu Creek is on the east side of the Cooper River. British Redoubt is for what we call Fort Fairlawn today, and the Colleton House, which was burned later on during the war, and Lewisfield Plantation. Now, here's another curious correspondence, I think, because it says it was written on July 17th, which was the day of the Battle of Shubrick's Plantation. I can't imagine Sumter writing this letter, this dispatch to Greene on that particular day, but he says 2 schooners were burnt at Watpu with stores. Okay, now this map is a little bit later. This is the SIMP map from 1800, but it shows right there at the bridge, and it's labeled such that there are stores there. Now, Wadbu Creek, all you researchers who are interested in this area, keep your eye on Wadbu Creek. I think it's a very important landing in this story. Back in 1970, I made a dive there, and I found that 6-pounder cannonball. The reason we were going there was because the Berkeley Country Club had been broken into, many golf clubs were stolen, the heat was on, they threw the golf clubs over the bridge, and so it went to the salvage golf clubs. Had no idea that revolution ever had anything to do with any of this. Found a cannonball, and Peter Spoon didn't think that much of it, but reported it, and it became noted by the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. In 1979, in the meantime, after that, during the 70s, various divers were going and finding Revolutionary War material. So it was reported to the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. They got money from Senator Rembert Dennis, and they went and spent about a 6-week project right there at the landing at Wadbu Creek in 1979. They set up a grid on the bottom, excavated 65 squares, 10 by 10 feet. So an awful lot of that bottom was excavated, and there are no intact shipwrecks there. In this letter, it says that 2 schooners were sunk there. However, if you take a look at this, there's a pile of frames from shipwrecks, and from somewhere, and so this is going to be an interesting investigation as future research is done as to what really happened at Wadbu Creek. One of the things that has my attention is take a look at some of these regimental buttons that were found there. Now, I will say, if some of y'all might be metal detectors, collectors or whatnot, a lot of times pewter buttons found on land are not in the best of shape, depending on what kind of soil they're in or whatnot. But underwater, a lot of these buttons are pretty nice looking. We've got the Scots Guards, the Royal Fusiliers, 7th Regiment, 16th and 17th Light Dragoons, who I think probably were in the area with Tarleton. 19th Regiment, the Green Howards, that was James Coates during this Dog Days Foray. 23rd, which was Balfour, I believe, 30th. 31st is interesting to me because they were, as far as I know, never in South Carolina. They were torn up pretty bad at Saratoga, but either somebody was transferred or somebody was wearing a uniform with the 31st button. And of course the 71st, they were all over the place. And some beautiful Continental buttons. They were all at Wadbu Creek. I'm not sure why this was happening, but I guess they were doing laundry there or something. But I think Wadbu Landing was a very important place for logistics as they were moving inland. I think that was one of the main landings up at the upper part of the Cooper River there. December 4th, 1780. I thought this was kind of telling. Balfour writes to Cornwallis. Balfour's in Charlestown. Cornwallis, I believe, was in Winsboro at this time. And he says, magazine is forming in Monk's Corner. Some provisions will be forwarded to Nielsen's. A galley will be at Wadby Bridge to defend the store there. So it sounds like, this is sort of telling us about when Fort Fairlawn is being established. I guess when they're calling a magazine being established, I don't know, you guys are the experts, but I'm thinking that might relate to Fort Fairlawn over on the other side of the river. Also, I think it's interesting that an armed galley is going to be stationed at this bridge or in the upper Cooper River area, I guess. And the last line I think is pretty telling. Marion is too formidable to trust so near the boats and stores without something better than militia. So they're sending Hessians and convalescents to man the Fort Fairlawn area, and I'm assuming over in the Wadbu area also. Now, thanks to Charles Baxley, I'm going to throw this slide in to give you an idea of what happened in the 1930s. Wadbu Creek and Biggins Creek came together to be the source of the Cooper River back at that time. In the 1930s, with the Santee Cooper electrification program, the Lakes Moultrie and Marions were built, and the Tailrace Canal was dug for probably at least 5 miles from the discharge of Lake Moultrie into the upper Cooper River. So the cranes dug this whole part of the river out. Where was the landing at Fort Fairlawn? Does it still exist? Did it get dug up? Well, you take a look at the Henry Smith map from the early 1900s, and you superimpose that on Google Earth, you can see put Colleton Castle and Fort Fairlawn where they're supposed to be, and it shows where the landing should be. Now, when they dug the Tailrace Canal, this was all rice fields along the river here, and when they dug the Tailrace Canal, they dumped the spoil into this marsh or this rice field and filled it in, and now it's a fairly nice neighborhood. We went diving and found that basically right there where you see the landing falling right up in the shallows is a landing. Landings would have been lined with ballast rocks. Many of these early landings were crib docks that were built out, filled in with bricks and rock and then dirt to build kind of a causeway out into the river. And sure enough, there's one here. But you can see where the cranes have dug all the way through there, and basically the rest of the river out there is clean, but the rock landing is still there. There's been no underwater archaeology there. It might be an interesting project for the future. One of my questions was, we're basing this on a 1911 map or whatever. Was this the way it looked in the Revolutionary War? Well, this is the Purcell map. If you overlay this on Google Earth, take a look at, take a look at where the lat long falls on that map, and it's right there. So it tells me that that landing, I don't know how heavily it was used during the Revolution, but there was a landing there. Which brings me to the main part of my story. I'm going to tell you about Mulsey Simmons. She died in 1848, age 88. She tells a story. Now, let me preface this by saying that letters from Sumter to Greene or any other correspondence that we knew about a few years back anyway, never mentioned this. Okay? This story came up in anecdotal account. It says that Mulsey Simmons was the younger sister of Keating Simmons, who owned the Lewisfield plantation. He was a very, very close friend of Francis Marion. In fact, I think he handled the legalities of his will when he died. He was in the 2nd Regiment and was paroled at the fall of Charlestown, and so was weathering out at his plantation. And from what I understand, the British came and went. They were right around the corner there. There was one account where Cornwallis actually stopped and ate there when he was traveling through. It says that coming up, this is the 16th of July, 1781, coming up from Goose Creek, Hampton and his men would go right by this, said that he took a detour to go in to see the Simmons. The account says he went to see his lady love, but we don't know if that might have been romanticizing the story. Said that he was warned not to come down there because there's British vessels at the landing. In fact, there were a gunboat and a cargo vessel in proximity. It says that he mustered his men. They went charging up there. They captured 78 prisoners and burned 2 vessels. Keating Simmons was said in this little account to have violated parole, gone off to join Marion, and may have been at Schubert's plantation fight the next day. That's not substantiated to my knowledge. And then the account ends with the Black Dragoons coming to try and hunt Keating Simmons down and not finding him. Where does this account come from? Well, in the 1840s, John B. Irving wrote a serialized account of a steamship voyage up the Cooper River and gave descriptions of the various plantations and so forth as you would travel from Charleston to Moncks Corner. The book was enlarged in 1932. It turns out that Irving never included this story in his account, but apparently Louisa Cheeves Stoney did. And the book was reprinted in 1969, and it looks like the account comes almost word for word out of Joseph Johnson's Traditions and Reminiscence of the American Revolution, published in 1851. Well, in 1985, 3 divers read, or one of them anyway, read The Day on the Cooper River, saw the Mulsey Simmons account, and they went out there. Now, I'm going to tell you, the bottom of the Cooper River in this area is mud bottom. This ship was burned. There was virtually nothing above the water line. But they go down, and Bobby Snowden, right here, hangs a hose, a gauge on something. He went to free it, and it was this 3-pounder gun. They almost immediately, they salvaged the gun and almost immediately went to Columbia and turned this gun and another one I'm going to show you over to the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, made the report, did the right thing. The state did some conservation on these guns, and the story develops. If you look right here, here's the house, Lewisfield House. This house until a few years ago, looked identical to what it would have looked like during the Revolutionary War. It was lived in more recent years by Senator Rembert Dennis. He passed away. His wife lived in it until a few years ago when she passed away. Then the house was sold, and the new owners have added wings to both sides. It's fairly attractive, and I'm sure it's functional for them, but it sure changes the look of the original 18th century house. The Lewisfield vessel is just off the bank here. Now, thanks to Leon Harris, we've got some pension records here, and we've got Redden McCoy saying that he was with, basically describing the trip with Wade Hampton and taking 80 prisoners from a sloop at Simmons Plantation. That's really gold as far as the research goes. And let's see, Bruce Hillis just found out, just met him a little while ago, found out he...
Well, last year Leon helped me, or he was the one that did the research, because I had this puzzle on my face that I couldn't find where Simon Plantation battle took place. Because that's what written and recited was Simon the Simmons ground.
Yep.
Was where he was with the taking of these prisoners.
Oh, that's your ancestor, right?
That's my fourth great grandfather.
There you go. Okay. Also, something that's John Robinson went to the Cooper River, taking some boats that belonged to the enemy. Now, this is what grabs me. Then they went to the brick church on Goose Creek. One of the things that I'm finding is the misuse of names. Now, when they went the next day, they went to Wadu Creek, but not Goose Creek, unless he had this reversed and they came from Goose Creek. Also, I mentioned earlier that when I was talking about Strawberry, if you look at the Muzon map and the Purcell map, I think that I had up there, they both called it Bono Ferry, which was the wrong name. And if you look at the Muzon map, he's calling Wadu Bridge Biggins Bridge. So we've got to be real careful when we look at these names on these maps. The other thing that Leon passed my way was on the same evening, we rejoined Sumter and went to Biggins Church on the opposite side of the Cooper River. So that tells me that the shipwrecks were sunk on the west side of the river, and it's still questionable about what we're going to find in the research and the archaeology about what happened on the east side of the river with vessels. The 3-pounder cannon went to Columbia and had conservation. It was loaded when it was recovered. Underneath the 3-pounder, the day the divers were digging around and finding that, they found a swivel gun. This weighs about 160 pounds. Maybe y'all are all familiar with these things, but they were lightweight and highly portable, I guess you could say, but they weighed about 160 pounds. Fired a half-pound shot, but very often they would be loaded with scrap iron, nails, rocks, whatever, and were a heck of a shotgun. In 1986, the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology came. They did an underwater survey using surface supplied equipment, using an airlift to excavate. I want to point out Carl Steen. This guy is a tremendous archaeologist and has been tremendous in the research that we've been doing. He was a contract archaeologist with the state at the time, but he was in charge of this project. During the excavation, as the airlift was going, they used a boat with a hollowed out section and a screen. They were screening the whatever the spoil that came up. The operator said, "Stop, stop, something's coming up." And it was the kind of waterlogged core of a cartridge box, and with approximately 69 caliber balls. A piece of bar shot, pewter spoon, and melted glass. And one of the artifacts that we're particularly excited about is this thing. when the divers were going along, standing up in the...
Go back one, you're going fast.
The divers came across an object that they thought, well, this could be the mast. And as they investigated, it was the base of the bilge pump. And interestingly enough, look at this, it's charred. This pump would have stood about 5.5 feet tall. It's now 21 inches and charred. So you can imagine how that vessel burned down virtually to the bilge before it took on water and went down. Here's a drawing basically of what's left. So when we're talking about a shipwreck, it's not the skeleton at the wheel with the mast and the sails waving in the current. It's not a whole lot left. But it really is typical of the vessels that plied the rivers. We know about a half a dozen of them in the Cooper River area. They were 40 to 60 feet long, probably mostly double enders. I'll show you a little bit more about the vessel construction in a minute, but I want to stop and comment on the second wreck. Now, at the time, we call it the Lewisfield wreck today. But the divers, or the archaeologists at the time, were calling it a couple different names. LL1 and LL2. Back during the Revolution, they called this area, this site, Little Landing. So Little Landing 1 was the gunboat out in front of the plantation house. About 1/3 of a mile down is another approximately 50-foot long right period wreck. It's nosed into the bank at low tide. You can see it. You can see the bow stem sticking up out of the water. The archaeologist at the time, Joe Beatty was one of them, a good friend of mine. He said they found some scraps of typical or right period 18th century glass fragments. That's about all they found. But I mean, it did burn. It did burn, and it was there. So it's probably a real good chance that was the second ship. About 1/3 of a mile down, probably at a landing there along the rice field bank, and they went down and set it afire. The state did their excavation in 1986. About a year or two later, one of the original divers, Bobby Snowden, and this diver, Scott Fulkerson, went out there, and Scott's wife had given him an underwater metal detector as a gift, and he went down there and he was fanning around and started going crazy, and he said, I don't think this thing's working, something's wrong. He talked to Bobby, he said, take me down, show me where it is. Do I need to stop? Are we 5 minutes? Okay. They went back down and they started digging outside the wreck, and here's another 3-pounder, and it apparently rolled out of the wreck when the thing turned. Oh, real quickly, I want to say that at the Berkeley Museum, a few years ago, you would have seen it wrapped in saran wrap because chunks of the barrel were falling off of it. We got a grant at the museum, sent it down to the Hunley lab. They restored it. They mapped the pieces coming off and put it back together, and now this thing will be around for many a century to come. I'm going to quickly run through this, but in order to clear up the legalities of who owned these guns before we spent money on it, we had to negotiate with the state archaeology department as well as the divers because they still had a share. They said if we got replicas made for them, they would relinquish any ownership of guns. So we had 3 cast guns made that looked beautiful. You can't tell them apart from the real thing. Presented it to them, so we were able to do that. This is a model that Billy Judd made of what this ship probably looked like, about a 50-footer double-ender. And it's a row galley, which means that in these shallow waters, you can see the oars here, in the shallow waters where you can't sail in the rivers, they could actually row. In fact, I think I have this slide. I don't know where this model is, but this is something I got off the internet that kind of shows